Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. The webinar will start in just a minute while we wait for everybody to connect. Good morning and welcome to this webinar on the PAFTRAC Africa CEO Trade Survey Report 2022 in collaboration with African Business Magazine and the Bank. I'm David Thomas, the editor of African Business Magazine. First, some housekeeping. French interpretation is available. Simply click on the globe on the bottom right-hand side of your screen and click on French. If you have any questions for our guests today, please drop them in the Q&A box and there will be time to answer them after the panel discussion. And a recording of this webinar will be sent to all registered participants to watch back at your leisure. In a time of global economic dislocation, African businesses need the right institutional framework to trade with confidence and certainty across borders. Since its launch on 1st of January 2021, the African Continental Free Trade Area has been the most ambitious scheme for driving intra-African commerce. The goals of the AfCFTA complement those of PAFTRAC, the Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee, which unites private sector leaders and provides a unique platform to support African trade. So it's very appropriate that this year's survey focuses on the impact of the free trade area. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Atomi Jr., Assistant Manager for the African Union and African Continental Free Trade Area Relations and Trade Policy at Bank, who will introduce the findings of this year's survey, and an esteemed panel of private sector and institutional leaders to discuss how the free trade area can help to boost African trade in a tough economic climate. So before I introduce our panel, I'm going to hand over to Patrick from Bank, who will walk us through the findings of this year's survey. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you much, David. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. David, just please let me know once you can see my screen and the presentation has commenced. David, can you see my screen? Great. All right. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick Atomi Jr., and I work with Bank's AU and AfCFTA Relations and Trade Policy Department. Bank also acts as the Secretariat for PAFTRAC, which is the Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee. Now, going into a bit about PAFTRAC. PAFTRAC is a platform that provides an advocacy platform for the private sector and African policymakers. It gives them a place to unite, share their views, and helps to drive Pan-African trade results by providing a framework for private sector engagement in trade and investment issues across the continent. Our goal is to enhance advocacy and support policy actions that are favorable to the private sector by convening meetings such as this between representatives of the AfCFTA, other government institutions, and the private sector to promote intra-African trade in line with Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want. Moving into the survey, this survey itself gives the private sector a platform to express its views directly. And the survey results inform an annual PAFTRAC report that is sent out to private sector and government representatives across the continent. The objective of the survey is to advocate for private sector views, inform policy reform, and shape the future of African trade through data-driven results. So we go around Africa, we collect the sentiments of the private sector, their challenges with accessing the AfCFTA intra-Africa trade, and we combine all of that into this report, which gives the private sector and the government an informed basis on which to inform policy changes across the continent. Just briefly about the methodology of the survey. It was a 63-question survey deployed over a period of 3 months in and francophone countries to respond. The survey gathered about 800 respondents hailing from 46 African countries. Now going into the genders and geographic breakdown of the respondents are still overwhelmingly male, with 80% being male and only 20% being female. However, they are very geographically diverse, with respondents coming from all reaches of the continent, particularly from West Africa. And this can be seen as an indication of just how much activity goes on in the West African region. The West was followed by East Africa and North Africa, and then South Africa. Moving into the profile of the respondents, you can see that a majority of them come from the agricultural sector, followed by the manufacturing sector, about half of that number, and the education sector. And this is in line with each of the individual sectors' contributions to GDP, with agriculture remaining the largest contributor to employment and GDP across Africa. Now, going into respondents' outlook on Africa in general, a macroeconomic view. The survey started out by asking respondents how they felt about the macroeconomic environment in Africa. This year, only 50% were either optimistic or very optimistic about Africa's economic outlook for 2022 and 2023, which is a steep decline, about 43%, from last year's respondents who were 93% optimistic about the future of Africa. And this is very understandable, with their concerns being about higher inflation prospects across the continent, the African government's debt burdens, and the overarching crisis that's come upon the global economy through the Russia-Ukraine war, which has contributed to global instability, significant increases in cost of food and energy resources across the planet. That being said, respondents are still optimistic about the AfCFTA and that it will boost intra-Africa trade, with about 93% of respondents at least somewhat optimistic about the AfCFTA. And this is an increase from last year, in which respondents were 86% confident about the AfCFTA. And to get an idea about region-specific optimism, we asked respondents which regions they found easiest to carry out intra-Africa trade. And there was a spotlight on South Africa and East Africa, with them ranking the highest. However, there is still a relatively low level of confidence about the ease of trade in Africa, because there's an overarching sentiment about trade not being very easy across the continent. While South Africa and East Africa are considered the easiest, they only rank 22% and about 21% in terms of ease of trade. So about 70% of the respondents still feel that it is relatively not easy to carry out trade across the continent. Now, diving a little bit deeper into the companies that are actually carrying out this trade, we can see that SMEs are overwhelmingly active in driving intra-Africa trade, with 22% of the survey respondents only earning over $1 million in revenue, and the majority of the respondents having been in operation for less than 5 years. So you can see that most of these respondents are newer, more informal companies and not operating at the level of the multinationals, with only 10% of them employing over 500 people. So overall, most of these respondents believe that the AfCFTA will have a significant positive effect on their business, with only a very small amount feeling that the AfCFTA will have either a negative or very negative effect on their business. So the positive sentiment is overwhelming, and people believe that the AfCFTA will contribute positively to the businesses. But that leads into the question, how do they access the AfCFTA? And as you can see from the chart, access to information remains a key challenge to the AfCFTA, with over 50% of respondents still feeling that they do not have sufficient information on how to access the AfCFTA. This is a slight improvement from the 2021 survey, in which 62% of respondents said that they did not have the requisite information to access the AfCFTA and information about it. But this shows that the AfCFTA needs to do better in terms of information, providing access to those who need it, particularly SMEs, who will be key in driving intra-Africa trade. So stakeholders who are driving AfCFTA implementation need to ensure that up-to-date information is accessible on the channels that these SMEs and other businesses are using, including search engines such as Google, social media, and dedicated websites. So continuing from what I said, access to information is very key to enterprises. As you can see from the results of the survey, most of the respondents said that what they would need to participate in the AfCFTA is more trade information, access to market opportunities, and fully functioning one-stop shops, which will enable them to essentially plug and play into the AfCFTA. So overall, you can see that what these people are looking for is convenience, flexibility, and overall ease of access to data and information about the AfCFTA. So that moves into inhibiting factors for the AfCFTA and reasons why people are finding it hard to access it. Moving again back to small and medium enterprises and their constraints to trade. When they were asked what were your main barriers to trade, both with regards to importing and exporting, the data aligns with what we mentioned earlier. Transportation logistics infrastructure contributes to about 50% of the complaints with regards to importing. But when it comes to both importing and exporting, you see that access to information highlights very importantly, with about 40% of people saying that this provided a challenge to imports, and about 59% saying that access to information was a big barrier when it came to exporting. Following on from this, there were concerns with regards to access to information on trading partners and counterparty payment risk. So traders were unsure that they would be able to get their money from people they were trading with and could not find information on partners to engage in business with across the continent. This goes back again to the importance of information in inter-Africa trade, knowing people across borders who they can participate in trade with, as well as information on these trade partners and the security in those partners' abilities to fulfill transactions. Further in cross-border trade, a majority of respondents said that in order to facilitate this trade, because informal cross-border trade was such a big part of cross-border trade across Africa, they said that it was important that there be a legal framework that legitimized this informal cross-border trade and had this as a priority policy area to facilitate trade across the continent. And following on from this, they said that increasing access to electronic payments and cross-border payments were key if they were going to participate in trade. This is very significant as the world becomes more tech-enabled, and cross-border payments are an important part of fulfilling intra-Africa trade. People want to be able to collect their payments electronically, and facilitating that will be a key way through which the AfCFTA is implemented. There is a universal consensus that this trade, particularly in the area of tourism, will be very important for business across Africa. Because we went into very specific industries, including tourism, finance, and manufacturing as part of this survey. And during the survey, 3 countries came out as very favorable for trade, and these were Ghana, Kenya, and Mauritius. They were ranked very highly in terms of business-friendly environments. And this is evident because governments such as Ghana have been implementing policies that have made it easier to perform trade and facilitate movements of people in the last couple of years. So it's very important that these things be done, facilitating visa-free travel and increasing investments in regional airlines. Both of these will facilitate the movements of people across borders and make it easier for them to carry out trade. We then moved into the manufacturing sector and asked them how they felt about intra-Africa trade and the policy recommendations that would help facilitate trade in their regions. Overwhelmingly, they responded 100%, saying that manufacturing is one of the key areas that would be impacted by the AfCFTA. And in this sector, the policy recommendations were the improvement of international media on African goods, the perception, stronger lobbying by African governments, and export promotion activities by these African governments. So you can see that it is not enough to have goods to trade and be willing to trade. African governments need to be active in promoting this trade across borders and promoting African goods as top quality and facilitating this trade, because if not, trade will not happen. If you have the goods, it's not enough to have them. The government needs to be active in promoting these goods. That brings us to the trade policy recommendations from this survey. It's overwhelmingly seen that SMEs dominate the Africa trading landscape, and thus it is imperative to avail them trade information and market opportunities and trade facilitation services, including those one-stop shops that were mentioned, so that they can easily participate in trade. Further to that, it will be important to give them access to credit and long-term financing mechanisms so that they can move into trade without the high interest rates and other financial burdens that are usually facilitated that are usually encountered in trade and are only available to multinationals who have a lot more leverage. Furthermore, it's important to facilitate the free movement of people across borders in order to unlock trade potential and opportunities across the continent. So the biggest areas that where it's important, these policies to facilitate trade are focusing on the SMEs, financing and access to credit for these SMEs, as well as the free movement of people across borders. However, it's also important to look at areas like creating one-stop shops where people can plug and play into the AfCFTA, as well as investments into trade-enabling infrastructure, particularly roads, which is key to moving goods across borders, as well as facilitating the formalization of informal cross-border trade, easing cross-border payments, and customs facilitation. All of this boils down to empowering SMEs and building their capacity through export support services, such as compliance, capacity development training, as well as improving quality standards, packaging, and customs procedure across borders. Thank you everyone for listening. The full report of this survey can be accessed at www.paftrac.afriximbank.com. And with that, David, I'm handing it over to you to hand over to our esteemed panelists. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Patrick. That's clearly a very valuable survey, and there's an awful amount that our panel can get stuck into there. So without further ado, I'll welcome our guests. Today we're joined by Professor Pat Atomi, Chairman of PAFTRAC, Cynthia Nasingbe Esanam, Senior Advisor to the Office of the Secretary General at the AfCFTA Secretariat, Hamadi Soma Bar, Senior Manager in Relationship Management at the International Islamic Trade Financing Department, and Pwensilia Boagure, who's a Government Affairs Director for Africa at Google. Welcome to all of you. Just a reminder to our guests that you can drop questions in the Q&A box and our panelists will try and answer those after the discussion. I think first let's turn to Professor Atomi at PAFTRAC. Clearly there's a huge amount of valuable information in the survey. I think probably one highlight that came out was the decline in economic optimism compared to last year. Last year, 93% of respondents were feeling optimistic about the economy. This year, just 50% are feeling optimistic. How do you think that will feed through into the rolling out of the free trade area? Do you think that these external economic factors that the continent is suffering from will lead to an increased appetite for new trade measurements?
Well, thank you so very much. I want to begin by saying that my disposition towards the success of this initiative is buoyed significantly by the increased acceptance of the catalyzing role that AfCFTA will play with trade on the continent. And I think that current global developments, like the challenges coming out of the war in Ukraine, do make it imperative for intra-African trade to help protect better the continent of Africa, even in a more globalized world. Let us take an example of one of the great challenges of now, which is food security across the continent. And the role that the availability of fertilizer, for example, has to play in that. And we will find that if we could actually collaborate across borders with partners from outside of the continent, we could ratchet up remarkably production of fertilizer within the continent and trading across borders such inputs that we will be better able to participate as a continent in international trade. I think that the increased confidence that will come to such transactions, with AfTA being more effective, with cross-border payments issues being taken care of, with technology facilitating overcoming information asymmetries, because those are the biggest challenges in trade, information asymmetries. I do think that the lessons that we draw from these surveys will better help engaging at a level that will give more confidence to the play that we can bring to the table in international trade. This is, for me, the great take from some of the movements that have taken place from last year to this year. And we must not fall back if global conditions ease. We must see that this is a strategic thing for Africa to do, so that we shore up our place and strengthen our hands in international trade with this ability to trade across boundaries, aggregate across boundaries, and be able to be a bigger stakeholder in international trade.
Thank you, Professor. Turning to Cynthia, I think obviously this survey does show a huge amount of optimism around the rollout of the free trade area, which is great to see, but we're talking about a very complex project here with difficult negotiations, which will, take time to bear fruit. Could you perhaps give us a bit of an update on where we are with the free trade area at the moment, and where we'd like to get to perhaps over the next few months?
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to thank you, to thank PAFTRAC for the invitation extended to the AfCFTA Secretariat to join this conversation, and specifically, and most importantly, I would like to congratulate the institution and its partners for this outstanding report, which in a way is a blueprint for the implementation also of the AfCFTA, as it provides real on-the-ground information as to what are the constraints for the private sector to fully take advantage of the AfCFTA, and what are the gaps that needs to be filled, so that we can better leverage on the private sector as we continue to implement this wonderful and important free trade agreement. In terms of the status of the negotiations, as you said, it's a comprehensive agreement with many protocols that cover trade in goods, trade in services, digital economy, investments, competition policy, women and youth in trades, etc. So at the moment, on 55 countries, we have 54 that have actually signed the agreement. And from those 54, we have 44 that have ratified. That means these 44 have actually deposited their instruments of ratifications and are therefore state parties to the agreement. So the negotiation, the agreement in terms of the negotiations and the implementation is divided into two phases. We have phase one, which covers trade in goods with all the annexes, that covers rules of origin, customs, and trade facilitation. We have also trade in services, which is part of phase one. And phase trade in services, 5 sectors have been identified as priority sectors as part of the negotiations. These are tourism, communication, financial, transportation, and business services. And we also have, as part of phase one, the dispute settlement mechanism. And as you know, a dispute resolution, this protocol is actually the heart of the AfCFTA, in the sense that it really shows commitment by the states, the state parties, as to their, the commitments that they will really follow the rules of the AfCFTA. So for the first time now, we're going to have a dispute resolution mechanism and a dispute settlement body on the continent that will take, or resolve all the issues that will arise under the AfCFTA. Now, the second phase there will cover the implementation on or the negotiations of the protocols on investments, competition policy, digital trade, as I mentioned before, intellectual property rights, also very important, and the women and the youth in trades. Also another important protocol, because and this is really an innovation from the African continent, because this is the first time that we have in the world a trade agreement that actually embeds a protocol on this for this particular targets, and obviously we know the reasons. The African economic, or let's say private sector, is really made up of SMEs in the informal sectors, the young and the women entrepreneurs. They are the drivers of the economy. So it's important that we actually work towards having an AfCFTA agreement that is as inclusive as possible, and that the benefits do not just only go to the big corporations, but also those targets. So we are at a level today where we are moving both phases concurrently. Some of the protocols are at more advanced stages in terms of negotiations, and some are very at an early stage, I would say at design stage. But I would like to speak more about the readiness for commercial meaningful trade, because since we have launched the AfCFTA and the Secretariat actually became operational, everybody's asking, when are we going to start trade? And in terms of the readiness and going back to the trade in goods protocol and the advancements that have been development that we have registered with regard to this protocol, we have today we have a convergence on the rules of origins for more than 88.7% of the tariff lines. So if today we consider that when we look at the customs rule book, we have, in the world, more than 6,000 products that are traded. 88.7% of those products on the continent today, the state parties have agreed the rules of origins. This is very important for our traders and for our business communities. And this has actually allowed us to launch last week what we call the AfCFTA guided and facilitated and guided trades initiative, where we actually we worked with 8 countries that are ready to trade under the AfCFTA, and some companies to really kickstart the trade under preferential terms of the AfCFTA. So much has been done. Rules of origins have been agreed. The only sectors that are yet pending in terms of agreements of the rules of origins are the textile and clothing and the motor vehicles. But today, the AfCFTA is up and rolling. We have countries which are trading. We have intra-AfCFTA trades happening. Also, other operational tools that have been established, or let's say deployed, to support the operationalization of the agreements are the e-tariff book. We have an e-tariff book available online. We have also the manual of the rules of origin that I've just spoken about. We have also deployed trading documents across our state parties. So the trading documents involve the origin declaration form, the certificates of origin, the suppliers declarations, etc. We have also a mechanism that can allow us or let's say allow economic operators to report non-tariff barriers and any type of restrictive practices that make trade difficult, inefficient, and costly. We have also talking about payment solutions and the necessity to really work on integrating our financial systems with the collaboration of the African Afrexim Bank. We have actually developed developed and deployed what we call the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, which is a cross-border financial markets infrastructure enabling payment transactions across Africa using African local currencies. And PAPS today, we should say, is one of the most important tools for Africa's integration and intra-Africa trades, as it will help really increase business competitiveness by reducing the cost of convertibility to the African economy that we all know today, and which has been estimated to be around $5 billion US per year. So this is a very important tool, which is being rolled out also effectively on the continent. We also, at the level of the AfCFTA and together with the AfricSimbank, deployed or we are on the verge of developing the AfCFTA adjustment fund facility, which will be a fund that will help alleviate, let's say, the adjustments costs that some party states may endure as a result of the free trade and the liberalization of goods and services. And that is also being developed really to support the implementation of the AfCFTA. And as part of this program also, AfricSimbank has already committed, I believe, $1 billion for these funds. So again, another important tool to support the private sector to implement the AfCFTA agreements. And again, we also, with regards to trade facilitations, there are also projects that are ongoing. We are adopting a corridor approach project, and today we are focusing on the Abidjan-Lagos project, where we'd like to develop a concrete soft and infrastructure project that will allow the customs to really talk to each other and make sure that we have effective corridors for effective flows of goods across the continent. So in a nutshell, I would like to say this is where we are in terms of implementation. And I think I will be able to speak to other points later as we go further in the discussion, in the conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Cynthia. Turning to you, Hamady, as Cynthia says, there's clearly a huge amount going on at the technical level. But one thing that's always held trade in Africa back has been the infrastructure deficit. And as an institution which works very much on improving trade infrastructure, where would you say the continent is at the moment, and what can organisations like yours do to help get the infrastructure to where it needs to be so that the AfCFTA can be as effective as it needs to be?
Great. Thank you, David. First of all, let me echo Cynthia's sentiment in thanking PAFTRAC for this great report and for all the work that's being done to support the FTA agenda. We at ITFC are strong believers that the FTCA is an integral tool in supporting intra-trade on the continent. If you look at Africa for us, it's a critical region. 27 out of ITFC's 57 member countries are based in Africa. So that's about 50% of the total OIC member countries. So we firmly believe that a successful implementation of the FTA will have a significant impact on ITFC's mission, which is to advance trade amongst the OIC member countries. Before I talk about the initiatives that we are working on to support trade on the continent, just to highlight that our interventions are twofold. We intervene on the trade financing component, but also on the trade development component. On the trade financing side, a key initiative that the management has taken in the last 12 months to really support trade and particularly the private sector is the establishment of the private sector division within the trade finance department. While ITFC has supported SMEs and private sector since its inception back in 2008, the establishment of this division really puts more impetus, focus in channeling resources to support the private sector and SMEs on the continent. So this was a very strategic move to support going forward, extending financing. As you know, the financing gap is one of the critical obstacles that has been mentioned and raised by participants across the board. Every year, we are talking about $80 to $120 billion in financing gap on the continent. So this private sector division focus will try to work with development partners, DFIs, FIs, to really attract as much financing as possible to support SMEs. A program also that we've launched back in 2008 and 2018 rather, and is in its fifth year now, is what we call the SME, the West Africa SME program. One thing that we've noticed in, throughout the years is the lack of capacity and technical assistance on the SME side. This program really objective is to support SMEs in helping them put together financing applications to banks, really to increase the likelihood, the chances of their applications being approved, accepted for financing. And it also looks at some of the gaps that exist on the bank side, because commercial banks generally are equipped to handle corporates, to deal with the risk associated with corporates. But when it comes to risk associated with SMEs, this is where we have a little bit of a gap, and hence the high rate of decline ratio when SMEs submit the financing applications to banks. So this West Africa SME program provides technical assistance, capacity building, both on the SME sides, to enable them to put applications that have a greater chance of success, but also provide assistance on the bank side to help them better assess SMEs' risk, with the ultimate objective to create more financing opportunities for SMEs. So this program was piloted in Senegal and Burkina Faso successfully, and now we're rolling it out in Cote d'Ivoire, and in the future we have plans also to roll out in other OIC member countries. So that on the trade financing side, these are the initiatives that we've been working on to support SMEs and the private sector at large. On the trade development side, ITFC is actively supporting the implementation of the AfCFTA in OIC member countries through its flagship program that we call the ITFC ISDB Africa Initiative. Basically, this initiative brings capacity building and technical assistance to support member countries with their national development strategies in terms of focusing on harmonization of customs codes with new tariff provisions, as Cynthia mentioned, looking at the application of rules of origin, as well as providing training to AfCFTA national stakeholders. Now, so that is one component of this initiative. The second component is really providing research in collaboration with AfrEximBank, with CESRIC, and other development partners. We've also provided research papers to highlight the potential impact of the AfCFTA on selected OIC member countries. So last but not least, as was highlighted by Patrick in the introduction, information scarcity is one of the big challenges also that the SMEs community have mentioned. Through this initiative, we are providing training to SMEs on how to export under the FTA, with partnership with AfrEximBank through the AfrEximBank Academy. We're providing online training to SMEs so that they can have access to markets, distribution channels, and financing and the likes. So the last initiative that I would like to talk about is the Africa Arab Trade Bridges program. And this was also something that was mentioned in the survey respondents, highlighting how can we get more collaboration between Arab states and African states. So the aim of this program is really to increase trade and investment flows across the Arab and Africa regions by fostering commercial partnerships on a B2B basis. We focus on different sectors, more prominently in the health sector, where we've seen a lot of activity with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we also focus on sectors like the agriculture sector. If you look at Africa, containing about 60% of the arable land, and we look at the Arab states, most likely are importing their critical food commodities. We see a strong partnership that can be had between the African region and the Arab region in this regard. Manufacturing is also another element that is highlighted under the Africa-Arab Trade Bridges program. I'll stop here, David, and happy to address any questions that that may be had. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hamady. Just turning now to Prensilia at Google. Clearly, the digital economy is an absolutely crucial part of ensuring that the AfCFTA works as it should do. And you can't really conceive of a free trade area nowadays without digital services. So what are some of the exciting things going on in that area, not only to capitalize on the AfCFTA, but also to make the AfCFTA more workable?
Well, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for the invitation to participate on this esteemed panel. I think Google, we share in the optimism that was expressed in the survey results. I think you said something like 93% are optimistic about the potential for the AfCFTA to have a positive impact on Africa's economy. And we wholeheartedly believe in that. The harmonization, the eliminating red tape, the making ease of trade easier. We believe that those things can have a positive impact on driving greater investment and facilitating greater trade. I think it's a difficult situation globally, right? We were talking about this context earlier about, an incoming recession and the wars and food shortages and crises and things like that. But when we look at the potential for growth and where is there some optimism, I actually believe that tech is an area, particularly in Africa, where we have potential for great optimism. And it makes me very excited. Over the next 5 years, Africa's internet economy is poised to reach $180 billion if we're able to harness technology and bring more people online. I think we're expecting to bring about 300 million more people online over the next 5 years who will access the internet for the very first time, mostly through their mobile devices, right? So this is changing how people access and interface with one another, with their communities, with their customers as well, because they're accessing it through their mobile devices. So how can we use these mobile devices for these SMEs in particular that constitute something like 96% of our employers and businesses on the continent? How can we bring more of them online through these mobile devices? So that's something that Google has really been committed to helping to bring more SMEs online, providing more digital skills training. We've committed to train 10 million Africans, of which we've already trained 6 million. And we're investing $1 billion over the next 5 years. Focusing on 4 key areas: on infrastructure, the piece that we were discussing earlier, so increasing connectivity so that more people have that access. Secondly, developing talent and human capital investment through the digital skilling and things like this. On innovation, this is an area actually also, I just want to briefly touch on this. The startup ecosystem is an area where there's tremendous potential, tremendous growth. Last year, startups on the continent raised something like $4 billion, and we've already surpassed that this year. And these startups are so important because they're bringing investment, and fintechs in particular are enabling the inclusion of people that are typically unbankable, that are in rural areas, that don't have access to some of this commercial lending that our ITFC colleague was discussing. So being able to provide some of that financial inclusiveness by supporting startups is really important. And the startup ecosystem on the continent is really strong in another area for potential growth. And then lastly, the regulatory ecosystem. this is really where the AfCFTA is going to come in to help create interoperability, things like data sharing, so that small, medium businesses in particular are able to share their data, are able to reach different markets, are able to facilitate payments, and make things a little bit easier. So I think overall we have some areas for optimism through tech. Tech is just a tool that can help us to achieve that economic growth. We think that our African economies can become digital sprinters and leapfrog. And so the AfCFTA is going to be really important to helping us to be able to do that. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Prensilia. Just a reminder to all our guests, if you'd like to ask questions to any of the panelists, please do put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the page. So it's a great chance to ask any questions that you want to know about the AfCFTA or Google or the Islamic Finance Institution. Turning back to Professor Atomi, obviously we've seen, a great deal of optimism, especially around, as Prensilia just said, the digital aspects of the trade opportunity. Working with your members, private sector, what are some of the key priorities and policy areas that you would like to see rolled out going forwards in response to this report?
Okay. Well, thank you so very much. One of the great sources of optimism for members of PAFTRAC is that increasingly there's an inclination to asking those who wear the shoe where it pinches. Because, traditionally, African governments go to these meetings to negotiate international trade, but don't have enough support from the African private sector. Now, the governments today now consider it important to have the private sector literally on the table. Makes a huge difference. Now, it makes it also enormously valuable to the private sector that the kinds of opportunity that are provided with after emphasizing participation by the small and medium scale enterprise sector, which is a huge difference in constituting African economies versus traditional economies dominated by large multinationals. But then it also then stimulates another very important aspect of engagement, which is the ability to aggregate and aggregate across borders. There are many small players in Africa who, if there were instruments and policies that facilitate aggregation across borders, if they were able to get together to have large trading companies that brought the kinds of impact to the Japanese economy that the Marubenis of this world brought, and of the Korean economy, that Africa would get a bigger share of world trade. And so as we get more digitally capable, and small scale producers across the continent can communicate more freely, and the possibilities of their certain standards they can work to, and then be pooled, by operators that are large trading companies, their access to global trade will be very, very significant. And this is really important for private sector players. And the expectation is that the work of the AfCFTA will be catalyzed, a true stimulant of this. Does excite PAFTRAC members. We are hoping that the liaison between the trade and economic teams at the AU with the development banks on the continent, the AfriExims, will create an enabling environment for small and medium scale players to scale up and collaborate across borders and reduce these information asymmetries that tend to make it difficult for them to get a fair shake, and get on the wrong end of transactions in international trade. So our hope is that all these efforts will be ratcheted up, knowing that it's important for us to leapfrog and become much more competitive than we are currently in international trade.
Thank you, Professor. So as you can possibly see, we've just been joined by another valuable guest, Dr. Amini Asfour, who's the CEO of the Africa Business Roundtable. Welcome, Amini. Maybe I'll come to you now, actually. One thing which we haven't yet discussed in this panel is the question of free movement, visas, exactly how the AfCFTA can help to spur the free movement of people and capital. What steps do you think that the continent should take to unlock that kind of potential?
So thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in this distinguished panelist. As the chair for Africa Business Council, actually, which is established in line with the Heads of State Decision Summit for boosting our intra-Africa trade and operationalizing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I'm really happy that you asked this because if we are really want to increase our intra-Africa trade, now it's only about 16%. If we are really heading towards this, we really need to see how I advocate for free movement of people and products. And this is the only way actually that we would like to see how we advocate it with the policy organs, with the heads of states, because to move our goods, we need free movement of people and goods. So one of the things actually we're acting upon for the first degree of freeing movement is to have at least business visas for all the business people and the private sector to make it very easy for them to move within the continent, because under the African Union with 55 countries, we are not able to move and take visa for every country. It is a must that we see how we advocate for this in order to unlock this obstacle of free movement. Now with free movement of goods, which is very important, I think this is the major role of the AfCFTA, to see how our governments now would really see how we can remove all the obstacles, whether tariff or non-tariff barriers, and to see how we make business linkages among our communities and the major issue also for operationalization of AfCFTA is to see how we have information about each other. Because normally now with all the private sector on the continent, and Africa Business Council really is the head umbrella, where PAFTRAC is our think tank, and I am glad about the survey that happens for the obstacles of the operationalization of AfCFTA and the perspectives of the CEOs with reference to operationalizing the AfCFTA and moving trades and goods. Many of our private sector on the West Africa, they are not aware of what's happening on the East Africa. They don't have no knowledge of the products within the continent. So one of the major steps that we are taking also as Africa Business Council is to do mapping exercise, what is existing on the continent, and this in collaboration with PAFTRAC as the think tank of Africa Business Council, to see what products is existing on the continent. What are we importing from outside the continent, and how we can figure out which products present in this in the continent, and this would come into clusters, because under Africa Business Council also we have like 20 clusters for trade, investment, industrialization, infrastructure, energy, creative industries, agriculture, agribusiness, SMEs development, women entrepreneurs, youth entrepreneurs. So under those 20 clusters, we are mineral development resources. We are currently trying to see how we make mapping exercise in each cluster, what is existing on the continent, pharmaceutical industries and and medical consumables and supplies, which is present in some parts of the continent, while it is already the other part of the continent is importing it from India or China. So the major issue of movement of people is also to know what is present within the continent. Like if we know, for instance, in Egypt, there is 165 pharmaceutical industries or 450 medical consumer supplies factories, while in other parts of the continent, we are still importing it and we know nothing. Right now, that's why a little bit late, we finished the African Congress for Women Entrepreneurs, SMEs, and Youth. Many of them are not aware what is present in the continent in order to buy from it. So the major issue is really how we make these business linkages among our private sector on the continent, how to promote also the value addition and use the expertise of some parts of the continent to the other, to link it with industrialization and scientific research and institute to promote industrialization, and to see how we as business people are free to move, but also free to invest, because this is very important, because investment in the continent, while we are trying to attract FDIs, there is domestic also investment in the continent, but we need incentives. And that's one of the recommendations actually we took on our meeting. We need to have incentives for the investment on the continent, because sometimes they give more incentives to multinational companies and they don't give incentives to local companies. So this is also part of the whole holistic approach of the whole issue of free movement of people and good, is to make local incentives for our local African private sector. Another thing we're advocating for, which is my really pushing, is how do we advocate for the government, for government procurement? At least 40% of government procurement goes to African local productive private sector, including SMEs, women and youth. Thank you.
Thank you. So Cynthia, as Dr. Asfour just laid out, and as was made fairly clear in the survey as well, there seems to be a bit of an information deficit, whether it's to the private sector or whether it's to countries on being able to share knowledge about the AfCFTA and about technical details. So what kind of plans do you have to come up with tackling that information deficit and sharing knowledge between partners?
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, we are very aware of this shortfall, if we can call it so. But I would like to say that the AfCFTA Secretariat is 2 years old and has been also operationalized in the middle of COVID. So it does take time. And when you look at the progress and the achievement that has happened in terms of the negotiations of the protocols and achieving the rules of origins, etc., you know, there is a balance that needs to, a lot has happened, but now it's time really to communicate, engage with our stakeholders, mainly the private sector, civil society also, you know, the academia, etc., to really, for everybody to own this AfCFTA, which is our baby really on the continent, and to make it work. So I would say internally, we have we are working on a strategy, a private sector engagement strategy, and the overall, I would say, objective is really to develop a pragmatic approach to mobilize private sector support and participation in the AfCFTA implementation process, and obviously activate its role as the key driver of intra-Africa trade. Specifically, what are we talking about is going to be about ensuring that a thorough understanding of the AfCFTA agreement by the African business community and the relevant stakeholders, and also, you know, their ownership, as I said earlier, and participation in the implementation process. It's going to be also about educating the MSMEs on what AfCFTA means practically to them and how it relates to their business activities and improve their competitiveness and operational capabilities through skills development and in trades and also through targeted support program. And I think our colleague earlier from ITFC has already mentioned the program that is already on the ground with AfCFTA delivering even, and also our International Trade Center, we have a program called How to Export under AfCFTA, which is running, and there are more programs that are being developed actually to really scale up our SMEs in terms of access to markets, access to information, etc. The strategy will also cover, public-private dialogue to ensure advocacy that really reflects all parties' interests and encourage stakeholders to not only just align with best practices, but also to undertake key reforms that I'm talking at national levels that are conducive to the attainment of these AfCFTA objectives. We also are looking at developing, I would say, a private sector participation framework that will be established within the secretariats for continuous engagement with the private sector on these matters of the implementation of the AfCFTA. And this is a work stream that we are really working on at the moment, is how do we make sure that we have some platforms. And when I say private sector platform, I'd rather say maybe private sector platforms, because when you talk about private sector, we have different interests. We have big corporations, we have SMEs, we have the young, the women entrepreneurs, etc. We can even look at them as, industry-based, but somehow we need a mechanism that allow those private sector platforms, which are led by the private sector, to engage continuously with the AfCFTA on key issues, on what are the challenges, what are the bottlenecks that needs to be taken out so that we actually see effective implementation of the AfCFTA. So with the African Business Council and all the business support organizations on the continent, we are going to actually do this work and see really what is the best mechanism to ensure this type of, I would say, private sector participation framework. And actually, we have also started some work with ITC, International Trade Center, to map the private sector, because today we're talking about the private sector, but who are they? What are the, what kind of SMEs are we talking about? Where are the entry points, the touch point for us to really optimize on the engagements, on the, on the engagement that we want to have with them? What are the characteristics of these SMEs in terms of competitiveness? How do they align with the priority value chains of the AfCFTA, etc.? So this is also work that is ongoing, and we hope that fairly soon we will be able to really have a structure that makes sense and that can allow us to move on those issues. We are also trying to, what we want to do with the strategy is also to facilitate investment in the key priority sectors. The AfCFTA, with the help of the MasterCard Foundation, has done a study a year ago, I believe, which has identified 4 key priority sectors, 4 value chains that we would like to focus on. And these sectors are agriculture and agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, automotive, and transport and logistics. So we are actively working with governments and also investors to really government to drive investment in these priority value chains, because the study actually reflected that strategic investment in these 4 value chains, if they are designed and implemented very well, would add $11 billion per annum in terms of production, and also more than $5 billion per annum in terms of intra-Africa growth that intra-Africa trade growth that we can see. Also, in terms of job creations, we can actually have more than 700,000 jobs that are created, and 50% of just those jobs could be really focused on youth and women. So there is potential, and we are as we are speaking today, for instance, going back to what Professor Pat mentioned earlier about the food security, we are actively working with countries such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, who are really grain producers, and each year see themselves with excess capacity of grains that are just, rotten because there is a lack of the capacity to process those grains into other food products, or a lack of storage capacity. So we are now putting these countries with the right investors to make sure that we develop the right storage capacity that they need, and that we actually invest in those, in that value chain to increase intra-Africa trade in the agricultural sector. So yes, there is a lack of information, and I know the report also mentioned the fact that it will be good to have maybe some digital platform. This is being done again with the AfricSimBank. I'm sure maybe they will be able to talk about it later, but there is this project called the Africa Trade Gateway, which is a nexus, I would say, of various platforms that will connect the African SMEs and entrepreneurs, and that will include B2B online marketplace for buyers and suppliers to exchange, cross-border goods in an efficient and cost-effective manner. And the platform will also host a trade information portal that will provide users with information of what is required to conduct cross-border business with a certain countries. There's going to be due diligence information about custom procedures, rules of origins, sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. So a lot is being done at the level of the Secretariat with our partners, and there is also gap for, and I think it's mentioned in the report, for other private sector, to actually tap into that. And at the end, what the role of the AfCFTA is really to be the convener, the facilitator, the gathering of all this information, and making sure that this information is disseminated in a very effective, efficient way to our stakeholders. So that's what maybe I can say with regards to that. And very important is for that, we have tools and platforms that are also, running. I will talk about the IATF, the International Intra-Africa Trade Fair, for instance, which runs every 2 years. It is a big opportunity for SMEs to participate, and because it's really the marketplace for the AfCFTA. So these type of platforms of events that are organized also yearly provides, a platform and opportunity for our SMEs to really engage, to matchmake, and get the information that they need. But certainly, we will be able to take these recommendations from this report. As I said in my initial intervention, it is really a blueprint, and this is what these recommendations really need to be translated into concrete projects and actionable work plan, I would say. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hamady, obviously, as Cynthia's just mentioned, SMEs have a great thirst for information, but at the moment, especially in a difficult economic climate, they also have a great thirst for credit. Are they getting the financial support they need at the moment to be able to take advantage of the new trading opportunities? Clearly, it's a difficult time for small enterprises across the continent. What needs to happen so that they can, they can overcome the short-term difficulties and prepare for the longer-term opportunities?
Oh, that's a great question, David. Wherever you turn, there are challenges facing access to financing, whether it's going through the COVID-19 pandemic, and now looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict. One thing that private capital really try to avoid at all costs is uncertainty. And right now we're going through that uncertainty at the global stage. At IFTFC, we've seen a significant increase in financing demand since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and now through the conflict and the ripple effect it's having on the global economy. If you look going into 2023, the picture is even gloomer, right? There's a There's a talk of about maybe a global recession into next year. So access to financing is going to be very difficult in the short term. Notwithstanding, at ITFC, I think this is where we and other MDBs have to play a greater role. Because of our MDB status, we're able to resource mobilize financing, capital, private capital that is sitting on the sideline to support SMEs. For every $5 that we approve for financing to SMEs and private sectors, $4 is coming from our partner financial institutions, might be commercial banks, might be other DFIs. Case in point, currently we're working with AfCFTA to come up with a financing package that will support SMEs and private sectors on the continent. And we've seen a success in terms of the resource mobilization efforts because the private capital is flowing through the likes of ITFC and AfCFTA, which have creditors, preferred credit status on the continent. So I think the question is how you channel the financing. If it's going through reputable, established MDBs, I think we have a role to play there to garner and attract more financing. But in terms of direct financing to SMEs, I think the picture might be a little bit gloomy in the sense that when we are in an uncertain situation, banks tends to be a little bit more reluctant in terms of their credit adjudication in terms of the sectors that they support. And SMEs, as we know, are the sectors that are most affected when it comes to the application of financing that get declined by the commercial banking space. So I think there is optimism. We feel that the capital is there. And what we need to do is MDBs to work more hand in hand to really tap into that capital flow that is sitting on the sideline to support SMEs as we go through these challenging times. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamidi. Turning back to you, Brent-Cilia, obviously another thing that probably we should give a bit more attention to is that the entire regulatory framework in which businesses operate. And for Google, this is obviously important, especially when it comes to digital harmonization. And there's some negotiations underway at the AfCFTA level to make this a reality. What do you think should be the priorities in digital trade negotiations so that not just large businesses, but also SMEs can actually capitalize on some of the opportunities we've been talking about this morning?
Yeah, thank you so much. So for regulations, I think for some of that digitally led growth that I was talking about earlier, we have to have a regulatory ecosystem that promotes competitiveness in general, right? And so the competition portion of the AfCFTA is going to be really critical, making sure that we're promoting competitive and fair markets, looking at cross-border data flows. If the digital trade protocol doesn't include that, then we're going to be restricting, the flow of data between borders. And as we're looking at the free movement of goods, we also have to look at the movement of data and how to do that responsibly and safely across borders. Tax regime that's established on international best practices and not disadvantaging SMEs, or any sector. So we want to make sure that the tax regime is addressed as well. And then also just, I mentioned startups as a really critical area for growth. And I feel like if there is more legislation that supports that if there is a component within the AfCFTA that supports our startups, that would be really, really helpful. We recently signed an MOU with the African Union Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals, Commissioner Albert Muchanga, to look at doing something like that. How do we draft legislation that can be adopted continent-wide that creates a more robust startup ecosystem to provide more incentives for startup founders, protections, tax exemptions, those sorts of things. And the goal really is to support SMEs and women entrepreneurs and youth who are the backbone, who are the majority of these founders for the startups. So if the AfCFTA could also have this sort of component, I feel like it would be really, really valuable to support economic growth. Thank you.
Can I come just here? I just want to comment, because just yesterday we finished the African Congress for Women and Youth and SMEs and Entrepreneurs, and we had a young entrepreneur from Africa that was talking about the ecosystem for strengthening the startups in Africa. So because we're also with Ambassador Moshenka, every time we have a startup session within our African Union private sector forum. So it's very nice here across this panel to see how everybody's working at the same thing. So as Africa Business Council private sector, we'll be happy to see how we collaborate, because I believe this panel is really about the collaboration alliances to achieve and realize the AfCFTA. So I'm happy to hear about the ecosystem, because we just talked about it yesterday in the conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Asfour. Just to piggyback on what she's saying. Sorry, David, I know you're trying to moderate here. I owe you a call, Dr. Asfour, so we can continue a conversation of how we can work together. But when we look at the startup legislation, the landscape on the continent, we only have regulations in Tunisia, Senegal, Rwanda has one, and that's basically it. Those are the only member states that have regulations that promote innovation, that sort of spur and proactively have legislation to support the startup ecosystem. So we have to do more to encourage more member states to support our SMEs, our women and youth entrepreneurs, as they are trying to embark and innovate and develop these technologies that can really change, the future for Africa. So thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you to all our panelists. That's been a very substantive discussion. And I think it's highlighted a lot of important areas in the report. We now have a bit of time for questions from our audience. And I think the first one is fairly important, probably should be directed towards Cynthia. And this is from one of our viewers. How can the AfCFTA control trade transactions without declarations of products that escape customs control? So I think that's really, showing that there's this huge informal economy in Africa, massive flows of unregulated trade. How can that be brought under the umbrella of the AfCFTA?
Yeah, thank you. It will take time for the AfCFTA to be really fully effective as we see it, we envision it. But as I said in my submissions, when you look at the framework itself, the objective of the AfCFTA, the agreement, is to reduce barriers, so tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers for me are even the most the most important barriers that needs to really be dismantled and eliminated. Because as long as, if an entrepreneur or a woman cross-border or a young entrepreneur sees that its product can move easily across borders and do not have actually do not have to take the risk has to take to actually smuggle the product through different routes, but that the product can come to a border and the customs procedures are as seamless as possible. The tariff that needs to be paid is known. The cost that needs to be paid is known, etc. I believe that this is how we will move from this type of smuggling products towards the AfCFTA, the trade under AfCFTA. So the objective, today I will not be able to say this is how we will do to control it. But what our objective is really to make sure that those barriers are dismantled. That will now increase trade flows in the normal systems. And everybody now I'm sure we will be able to move from the informal sector to the formal sector. We just need to make sure that the infrastructure is there, that at the borders, everybody knows their rights, that when they get to the border, it's as seamless as possible. And I'm sure we will be able to, it will be just a natural outcome out of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia.
David, please, I want to address this because as just Cynthia said about awareness, yesterday also during our Congress, we had a fantastic, we have with us here some cross-border women traders from Zimbabwe. So we had an actual scene, actors, she was acting what's happening on the cross-border trade, the cross-borders. She was acting how is happening as she is a cross-border trader and putting things, she was wearing many clothes and putting things in, hiding things in her head, in her bag, everywhere. And then the cross-border, the custom officials trying harassing her. What is this? What is this? He let her, she was really undressing her. So, I mean, we went through the act as it is, and then she doesn't know that she has actually could have $2,000 that is free that she can pass with it cargo products. She doesn't know. She doesn't know the simplified trade regime about COMESA. She doesn't know about AfCFTA. The custom official doesn't let her aware of anything. On the contrary, they are harassing her and taking money out of her. So one of the others, she had like 15 papaya. He got from her 5 papaya. So she's only left with 10 papaya to cross the border with it. So this is the right thing. And because you rightly said informal trade, this is what we are experiencing and suffering in Africa. What recommendation we said is that we need to do awareness campaigns and sensitization about AfCFTA with the cross-border women traders. We need to train the custom officials and to put posters on the board. And we put hotline. This we can do it together, Cynthia, with African Union, with Africa Business Council. We need to have a hotline to be reported, anything to be reported on the border, and put posters for the cross-border traders to know what are their rights, and they are exempted of custom exemptions according to this amount. And we have training. This should be really reported. So I am happy that you raised this question, David, and thank you, Cynthia, for response. I think it's our responsibility of us to see and monitor what's happening on the cross-border and make awareness about what we are doing at AfCFTA and how we implement it.
Yeah, I think you've already, basically, explored the next question I was going to ask, which was indeed about the role of customs officials and, the training that's required for tens of thousands of customs staff across the continent to be aware of what the new rules are and what they can do to help rather than hinder trade. And Cynthia, are you confident that those messages are getting through? Are national authorities helping to pass those onto their own staff rather than the Secretariat itself having to coordinate all of this?
No, there's definitely training that needs to be done and awareness raising, as Dr. Asfour has mentioned. And as part of the architecture, normally all the countries are supposed to have what we call the national implementation committees and the AfCFTA national implementation committees. And what we have actually seen with the pilots, the guided trade that we have just experienced recently, is that these committees are very important because the fact that we had actually all the stakeholders around the table to coordinate these trades. So this means that we had the customs agents, we had the national implementation committees, we had all the various stakeholders were around. So it's there is I don't know how to say it allows everybody to be aware of the final objective and actually do the work that needs to be done. So we definitely through the regs also we have to intensify the trainings, but then advocacy, I would say, also come from the bottom up. So it's the people who are, as Dr. Amani said, who are passing through the borders, if they know the rights, and if really there is political will behind to really make sure that at the borders, people are there to do the job, I think that we will get to the results that we want. But yes, the AfCFTA will definitely make sure that through our engagement, we work with the National Implementation Committee, also with the regs that are playing a very important role. And hopefully we will be able to to achieve these the results that we want. Thank you.
Turning to you, Hamadi, with another question from our audience. Obviously, skills is a key part when it comes to the private sector of being able to take advantage of the opportunities of the AfCFTA. So are these skills to be taught by private sector firms themselves? Do there need to be overarching educational mechanisms for how businesses, especially small ones, can participate in the AfCFTA and intra-African trading?
No, that's a great question. I think education is everything. I think as one of the panelists mentioned, focusing on education is going to be critical in terms of really giving the environment for the SMEs to know where to go to really tap into this AfCFTA. Right now, information sharing is one of the critical obstacles in addition to financing, as we talked about. So really deploying efforts in this sector would really be helpful in this regard. As I mentioned in my earlier introduction, one of the initiatives that we're working on is to see how we can really share that information within the OIC member countries in terms of the SMEs, particularly on how to export within the AfCFTA context by providing online training, by providing information in terms of how to access financing, how to create those markets, and how to develop the distribution channels. I think all that is going to be fundamental with all partners working hand in hand to be able to provide that information to the SMEs, because a lot of the information is online, but a lot of SMEs do not have access to the information online. Now, how do we move from the online phase to provide other means that the SMEs can access this information would be something that we can think about in that regard.
Sure, thank you. And I think a final question is directed towards Pensilia. And I think we touched earlier on the regulatory systems that need to be put in place for digital commerce to thrive. So on the one hand, we had the discussion around at the AfCFTA level, which is all very positive. On the other hand, you see countries which are signed up to the AfCFTA, which don't enjoy a particularly harmonious relationship with big tech, let's say. So even this week, you saw Nigeria suing Meta for over some advertising. So what's the disconnect there? And, you know, how do we, given that the AfCFTA is so positive, how do you bring that to individual countries who may even be signatories to the AfCFTA?
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. I think at the end of the day, it's really about creating a platform for greater conversation and engagement, policy engagement. And so if the AfCFTA can serve as that mechanism, that platform that can drive the conversation between member states and tech companies, you know, we would love that. We want greater engagement, you know, with member states so that there is more awareness about our business models, about how we are actually contributing to societies, how we are supporting citizens and aligning our investments with national agendas and priorities. And also how we will be impacted by the regulations that will be enacted through the AfCFTA. So I think there's just a need for greater dialogue and for us to be able to share, like, here is what we're seeing in this region. When we enact this type of law in the Middle East, for example, this is what we've seen happen. This is the benefit of this law. This is what we've seen in the EU. This is what we've seen in different regions, to compare and contrast and take the best of what's already going on globally to adapt it and shape it for what we need here on the continent. But it's just about a greater dialogue, direct dialogue, and there's no substitute for this, right? So Cynthia, I'm pleading, I'm begging, you know, I'm constantly asking, but I think we just need more of these sorts of conversations that you all are facilitating today, but directly with governments, so that we can clarify points and address how we can be more helpful and supportive in this process.
Sure. Well, thank you very much to all our guests today. I think that's been a really stimulating discussion, and we've covered an awful lot of ground. just a reminder to all participants, attendees, you will be sent a recording of the event. So if you want to track back and listen to anything again, you'll be able to do so. And just a reminder that you can access the full reports that we're talking about today at www.paftrac.afreximbank.com. So thank you very much for joining us today. Have a productive day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you.